All right. Hey, thanks everybody for coming out. You made it through the rainstorms and didn't get washed away. My name is Luke Melia. I'm your meetup organizer. And this is the Ember.js NYC meetup. What? So if you're in the wrong place, now's the time. I'd like to thank Pivotal Labs for hosting us tonight. Pivotal, for those of you who don't know, is a consultancy, agile consultancy here in New York City, San Francisco, Boulder. Where else am I missing? London. Good stuff. Boston. So if you are looking to hire a talented consultancy, or you would like to work at a great place to work, you should talk to Micah Young, who's up here in the corner. Thank you. Pivotal's been hosting us for almost the better part of a year now, providing pizza and drinks and a big space, which is hard to come by in New York, so we really appreciate them. Yep, good stuff. The other sponsor of the meetup tonight is Yap, which is my company, and it's the easiest way for a consumer to create their mobile application. All powered by Ember, so if you or somebody in your life needs to create a simple mobile app, check it out, yap.us. Upcoming meetups. This coming Tuesday night, we have the next installment of our Hacker Hours, organized by Excel and hosted graciously by Red Rover and SimpleReach. The Hacker Hours are a kind of intimate, more intimate opportunity than this meetup to get questions answered, sit down, work one-on-one with another Emberist, maybe somebody who's got more experience than you, maybe somebody with less experience that you can help come up to speed. It's been a really successful series that has been totally community organized, and so it's really great to see that take off. It looks like we are already full for Tuesday. There's 4 people on the waiting list, so keep your eyes out for the next one. We've been doing these every 2 weeks or so. The next meetup there is definitely space in. It's our June meetup, which is going to be June 20th, and we're calling this one the Promised Land. It's going to be a 2-part presentation, with the first part being by Dominic DeNicola, who is very active in the kind of promises world, works on the Promises A+ spec, and our own Stefan Penner, who's no stranger to the Ember NYC stage, who's going to talk about promises in Ember. So this is it's an interesting topic. It can be a mind-bending topic as you're first learning promises. So I think that this is going to be a really valuable one. You'll also notice this meetup has not been announced yet. So if you want to go to meetup.com, Ember.js NYC, and sign up, you can do it now. We're going to announce it right now. There we go. At this point, any announcements from you guys? People who are hiring Ember developers, looking to work at an Ember place, events, anything else people want to share? Anybody? Yeah.
So we're hiring. If you like Ember and you don't mind things that are scary like .NET, then please come talk to me.
Cool, Ember and .NET. Awesome. Yes, Chris.
Should we announce?
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Right.
Here, let me give you a mic, actually.
Thank you. I didn't know if that was
That's fine.
public knowledge.
Yep.
So I'm very glad to announce that yapplabs, which is the consultancy wing of Yap that was started about a month ago, and MAG Labs, which is the R&D organization for McGraw-Hill Education that has been, I think, supporting Ember and building our own Ember app and working on some other things, has decided to work together on something really, really big. We'll announce it and in more detail, but the general idea is that I presented, I think, 2 meetups ago.
Just last meetup.
Yeah. About oasis.js, which is essentially a composable web framework where you can put different JavaScript apps together, of which you can certainly have Ember be the app. And we're thinking of using that framework to do some learning environments, really innovative stuff on tablets on the web. And it came across to us is that that would be proprietary software for a good reason. We should really show the world the same way I think the scores show what you can do with Ember. We should do an open source app using the component framework Oasis as also a way to improve the APIs and work with Cyril and David, who are working with Tilde on behalf of MAG Labs on improving Oasis and the semantic library on top of that called conductor. So we are building a GitHub dashboard that allows you to plug in various type of components that will allow you to use a GitHub ID to see a full picture of all your different dimensions of your projects, and it allows you to basically extend. If Travis CI is your thing, we'll create a contract for what a CI tool will report back and what UI you can own. But if you have a competing one, you can write it using a similar kind of contract, but you can have completely different UI that will plug together, and all the data will synchronize the way an Ember app is. Except you can write that little component in Backbone, Angular, anything else, and it's a pure JavaScript library. So I think that would be a really, really exciting thing for us to be able to demo. Hopefully in 1 or 2 meetup, depends on how quickly I can get the CSS guy on board. But I'm very excited about this, and so just a little pre-announcement of like, I can't contain my excitement, I can't wait until the next one. So
Yeah, awesome.
I'm so excited to work with you guys on this one. This will be awesome.
Cool. Yeah, we're excited to work in the project too. This is one of the awesome things about this kind of consulting work is that it is open source from the get-go. So it feels great to be able to not only be helping MHE prove out some really awesome technology, but be able to do it in a way that can provide a real learning opportunity for the community at the same time. Good. Any other announcements? Okay, awesome. Speaking of Tilde, Tilde, for those of you who don't know, is a consultancy out in San Francisco that was started by, among others, Yehuda Katz and Tom Dale, who also started Ember. And they're going to be in New York June 24th and 26th doing an Intro to Ember training, a 3-day event. There's pretty much no one more direct that you could learn Ember from than Yehuda and Tom. So they're going to be here. There's still some spots available. So if you want a real intensive opportunity to learn, definitely check that out. Related to that trip that they're taking out to New York, we're working with them to try to schedule a talk on the evening of June 26th, but Pivotal, this space is unavailable. So I'm looking for another space that can hold kind of this amount of people or more. Awesome. Please talk to me after. That would be great. So we're going to, hopefully we can make that happen if you want to hold the date. Looking at, again, the evening of June 26th. It was a Wednesday night, I believe. You may or may not be aware that these meetups are get videotaped, and they get edited a little bit and uploaded along with good sort of timings up to our Ember NYC YouTube channel. That's all thanks to the work of Lee Nussbaum, who's here making it happen every month. Thank you, Lee. The thing to know about that too is that if you have questions during the event, if you have comments, try to be mic'd when you do them so that the people at home can follow along and understand what's going on here.
And always repeat the question.
Steph said, always repeat the question. Yes. For this last section, I want to invite Alex Machnier up to talk about Embercasts.
Hey everyone. My name is Alex. I'm one of the 2 guys working on this new site that just launched pretty much a week ago called Embercasts.com. It's pretty much totally ripping off railscast.com if you've ever gone there to learn some of your Rails stuff before. Right now we only got 4 episodes up, but there's going to be some more starting this weekend. And basically we want to, it's kind of a rare opportunity, whereas Railscast is some guy who happens to be very good at Rails. On the Embercast team, we have one guy who is the guy who spoke at this last meetup. His name's Eric Brin. He's one of the core members on the Ember core team. And the other guy working on it is me. I contribute sometimes whenever I can. So I'm excited about this for many reasons, one of them being that we get some good feedback just from trying to nail down these correct solutions, if there ever is one, to how to do some cool things like authentication or how to get an autocomplete widget set up. And if we run into anything along the way that just doesn't quite make sense, even if there's been like talk of it being possible before, we have a lot of nice feedback, which is, if something doesn't go too well or could be simplified, then we end up usually contributing something nicer to Ember and so on and so forth. So anyway, really excited about this. Hope everyone can check it out and give us some feedback. If you have any episode suggestions for anything you'd like to see, you can just tweet at Embercasts, and we'll get back to you and let you know how soon that might happen. So that's it.
Awesome. Thanks for putting that together. Okay, so our agenda for tonight, we've got 3 great talks, and then possibly punctuated by a wacky game show segment, depending on Alex's progress during the first 2 talks. And then we're going to go out for drinks afterwards. We're going to a place called Old Town Bar, I think it's called, which I'll make sure that everyone has the address towards the end. So the 3 talks are going to be, I'm going to do a talk about refactoring from a jQuery kind of style app to Ember. Chris Selden, who's a member of the Ember core team and is out from Seattle this week, is going to do a talk on thinking in Ember and a solution called buffered proxy. And then Alex, if we are in good shape, is going to do our game show segment. And then our main talk tonight is Ryan Toronto. He's going to do a talk about prototyping Ember apps. How do you get started kind of from nothing and quickly get something up and running that you can work with? So without further ado, I'm going to fire up my presentation and get rolling. Oh, actually, I do have further ado. I just want to, just by a show of hands, who here has never worked with Ember before, hands-on, and just checking it out? Okay, cool. Who here has toyed around with it and not put something in production? Okay, and who has production apps in Ember out there? Okay, awesome. So that's actually like roughly third. So great. Thank you all for coming out. We're going to try to make content accessible and valuable for all those groups. Okay, so refactoring jQuery to Ember. Just a little bit about me. I mentioned I work at Yap. I've got a couple of kids and live here in Chelsea, and I like to play beach volleyball in my spare time. I've been doing Ember since before it was called Ember, kind of accidentally, but I've been really fallen in love with it in a lot of ways, and really love the power that it gives you and the things that you can create. So this is a kind of weird talk, right? Because Ember uses jQuery, so can you really refactor from jQuery to Ember? It's kind of odd. You got me. So to be specific, it's really about moving code that's written in kind of jQuery plugin style to an Ember app. Now, what's the matter with that? We'll talk a little bit about that. The lessons in this talk that I'm going to share were based on a recent app that I moved over from a kind of wild jQuery app, whereas we had a lot of jQuery stuff mixed in with Rails ERB stuff and or some RJS. Actually, some JS.ERB. I don't know if it was actually RJS. But we ended up with a very clean Ember app. But what we started with was spaghetti. Now, there's 3 types of jQuery code that we're going to kind of think about when I kind of break it down. One is kind of plugin activation. So you're grabbing some DOM and you're saying, apply this jQuery plugin to it. Another is more simple event handling. And then there's a whole kind of suite of jQuery-oriented JavaScript functions that are called from your jQuery event handlers, or our $. Function sort of globals. And the reason that this style often becomes problematic is a few things. One is that it can get sprawling. It's very hard to think about how to organize big jQuery apps. Just out of curiosity, has anybody ever built a jQuery app that's kind of got out of hand in that way? Okay, cool. Me too. So also, there tends to be globals everywhere. Now, maybe you could say it's not a global if it's under the $, possibly. But the worst thing about it, I think, is that it tends to rely on what we call truth in DOM. And one of the kind of core philosophies of Ember and Insights is that when you have truth in DOM, you're in trouble. Because DOM elements can go away. They can, you can lose track of how to find them. And so if you keep truth in JavaScript, it's much easier to write kind of clean domain logic purely in JavaScript, and then have the DOM reflect that domain logic. So what's this refactoring thing? as soon as I said I should probably give kind of a definition, there's one canonical definition out there, which is Martin Fowler's. And it's important in the steps that I'm going to go through to kind of think about this. So refactoring is a disciplined technique for restructuring an existing body of code, altering its internal structure without changing the external behavior. And he goes on. At its heart, it's a series of small behavior-preserving transformations, and each one is called a refactoring, does just a little bit, but the sequence can produce a really significant restructuring. And since each step you're taking is very small, you're less likely to make a mistake and to know as soon as you make a mistake and be able to fix it. And during it, this is very important, in this talk, the system's kept fully working after each of these refactorings, reducing the chance that you end up in a situation, I'm paraphrasing now, where you've taken the whole engine apart and all the pieces are on the floor and you have no idea how to get it back together again. So that's Martin Fowler. He actually has a book called Refactoring, which I recommend highly. So here's our starting point. We've got a web page. We've got an area of the page that's powered by a jQuery plugin and then maybe some other jQuery event handlers. It works, but the app has gotten difficult to maintain, and maybe there's some areas that you know that Ember is going to help you kind of grow and move in the direction that you want to go. So step one is to create an Ember app. And to do that, what you're going to do is create a div, give it an ID of something. App's a nice one. And then when you create your Ember application, specify that root element. There's your Ember app. So far, it doesn't do anything, but it's on the page. Have we broken anything yet? No. The next thing, let's create an Ember view. And let's, just as an example, we're not going to go through at a super detailed code level today, but anyone familiar with the jcrop plugin? What it does, yep, cool. So what it does is you can have a picture and call jcrop on the div that surrounds it, and then it'll give you some nice cropping UI to be able to create maybe a nice profile image for a social network or something like that. So what we're going to do is inside of our application view template, we're going to say render crop. And this will render this pair, the crop view and the crop controller. And we'll tell the crop view that it's got a template name of crop, which means that it's going to use our crop handlebars. I have no idea why that sparkled like that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take the HTML that the jQuery is acting on, and we're going to pull it out, and we're going to move it to the crop handlebars template. So that's going to get rendered. There's no curly braces in there to do cool handlebar stuff. It's just going to be HTML, so we haven't broken anything yet, right? Seems good. The jQuery can still find that div. Step 3 is to call the jQuery plugin from didInsertElement. didInsertElement is a lifecycle hook that happens once your Ember element has been added to the DOM, so your template's been rendered. This is your hook. And so what we can say is find the crop element, with the element with the ID crop, and call jcrop on it. This is exactly the same, but without the this.dollar that was in the original document. But we're just going to now move it inside of this crop view. Everything else we're going to leave the same. Any other event handlers, functions can just stay where they are. We are going to remove this original call from the other part of the document at this point. And everything should still continue to run. One way to make this even simpler is we can say that this crop view should have an element ID of crop itself. And then we'll be able to change this to just this.dollar sign, parentheses. And this represents the element for this view. So if you haven't seen this in Ember, this is really useful. And it's a jQuery wrapped set element. So anything you can do with jQuery, you now have a handle to this view's element, and you can go have at it. You also, once you make that change, you'll probably want to remove the outermost div that's inside of your template, the one that had div ID crop, because now otherwise it'll be duplicated there. Step 4 is to convert your jQuery event handlers to view event handlers or to action helpers. So let's say we had this in the original. So we had the main jQuery crop bit, and then we have a button that had a class and it's the button's text is expand. And we, using jQuery, we're going to grab that, and on click, we're going to tell it to call a special funky resize method. I think I might have called that funky resize only later, so it's supposed to be the same thing. Yeah, there's funky resize. What we're going to do is we're going to take that original event handler and we're going to remove it from the original part of the document, and then we're going to add a curly brace action helper here that's going to send the expand action, and we're going to say send it to the view, target equals view. In the view, we're going to have a method called expand that does the same thing that the original event handler does, calls funky resize 300. So these are now, those two things are now equivalent. Again, didn't break anything yet. Funky resize, it's interesting to note here, is not yet part of kind of your Ember app. It's just still hanging out there in your old jQuery code. But it shouldn't be all the way out there, because now we know the only place where we're calling this, we can do a quick search of the app's code, the only place we're calling this is from this handler. So let's now pull it into this view file's closure. Now most, any kind of build tool, if you're using Ember Rails or Rake Pipeline or Grunt, you're, most likely you've got each of your files is going to be a closure. So that now funky resize is not visible to the whole document anymore. It's only visible inside of this file where it's being used. So this is already reducing coupling and kind of that spaghetti stuff that we saw earlier. Quick sidebar, what's a closure? So what I mean more precisely is an immediately invoked function expression. And this basically, here's just a really simple example. You have a function, you do some stuff in the function, and at the end of the function, you call it by saying open parentheses, close parentheses. What's important is that outside of this function, variables that you declare with var here are not visible. So it provides a kind of private scope, module scope, if you will, so that you can limit interactions between different parts of your system and prevent you from accidentally stepping on your own toes as you're building different features and functionality. So step 6 is to then take those library functions, which are now just sitting in our file, inside the closure, but not integrated with the view at all. And what I like to do is I like to take those and make them instance methods on the view file. And what this lets you do then is to pull out variables that are being used, then those can become instance variables of the view. So I think we've got. I don't have an example of that, but hopefully you get the basic idea. Any leftover global calls, $ global calls, which you will often have in these library functions, once they're now instance methods, you can replace the $ with this $. And again, the this $, any kind of selector expression you pass in here is scoped to just this view's element. So again, we're just kind of, each step we take, we're kind of containing this complexity into just this view and template. Step 8, there's only one more after this, is to extract properties. So let's say that our funky resize method looks something like this. If this orientation is horizontal, this probably started off as just maybe a global. We've moved it to become an instance variable. If it's horizontal, then use jQuery to set the width of the element to our parameter that we pass in plus 600. If it's not horizontal, same thing, plus 400. So what we can do is we can simplify this conditional by extracting a base width computed property. Computed property in Ember is essentially a function that can depend on some other property. It caches its value, and you call it with .get. So what this one is doing is getting the orientation, and depending on the orientation, it's returning either 600 or 400 as the base width. And now our funky resize method can just say, okay, my new width is going to be my parameter I pass in plus the base width, set it. So we didn't get rid of a conditional completely, right? This ternary operation is still basically a conditional, but it's much simpler, less going on in each place, and these things are more composable as well, particularly the property. Finally, you may find that some of these properties that you're extracting or methods, as you scan through them, they're not touching the DOM themselves at all. For the things that are not touching the DOM, give serious consideration to pulling those out of the view and up into the controller, in this case, the crop controller. And reason for doing this is that it's basically just a nice clean separation between logic that is doing DOM manipulation, handling DOM events, stuff that's really close to the kind of metal of the browser, and stuff that is maybe presentation oriented in your controller, but is not actually doing any kind of DOM manipulation. So in this example, we've moved both orientation and base width up because neither of them have any direct DOM interaction. And when you do that, the crop view now can refer to that property in the controller as this.getController.baseWidth. So you're going to end up with a smaller view by doing that. So that's basically the process. If you follow those steps, you can safely and maybe not quickly, this can take a little while, but certainly successfully move from a jQuery style operation. Then you would repeat this with different parts of the page as you have different interactions. But that's the set of steps. A couple of caveats. If you use jQuery plugins that rewrite the DOM substantially, so I think that Isotope is an example, or Masonry is an example, I should say, of that. That can break bindings. And as you might see in, if you look at an Ember app, we have a lot of these kind of script tags, because they say metamorph ID, I think. Those things are used by Ember to know how to, where to update the template as various parts of your viewer controller change. And if the jQuery plugin removes those or moves those, Ember will fail to be able to do that. And also, just make sure that we didn't show this, but if your jQuery method has some teardown, maybe you need to call .off for an event handler, or maybe your plugin has a specific teardown method, that should be called in the will destroy element hook of the view. And that is it. I'm Luke Mealy on Twitter. Questions about this talk?
Yeah, I'm used to having a script tag that's typing X handlebars, but I saw here you just created a div, and then in the code you specified that the template name was that div's last name or ID.
Yep. Okay. So the question was, Casey's used to having a script tag in your index.html file, for example, that says type equals text/handlebars, and then your handlebars template goes inside that. And in the examples that I used, I talked about a .handlebars file. So both of these end up being the same thing at runtime. In the case of the script tags, what happens is when Ember boots, it scans your document for those script tags, and it basically ingests and compiles those handlebars templates into the ember.templates kind of a registry. In the case of the separate files, it's your build tool that is going to do that step. So that might be Ember Rails, Rake Pipeline, etc. It's a great way to work because as your app grows, having all those templates in one file can be a real drag. But again, you're going to want some kind of tool to help you do that. Other questions? Joey?
So I feel like in vanilla jQuery, there's a lot of, there's nothing preventing reaching up to the primary parents, affecting other things on the page. Did you into that?
Yeah, so the question was, in a vanilla jQuery app, there's nothing to stop. In fact, it's pretty common for elements to say like $.parent selector and mess with stuff that's maybe outside of their area. You definitely need to watch out for that. What I would, there's a couple of approaches actually. One is, it's okay as you go for that to happen. I mean, the DOM is still, perhaps basically that structure. If not, maybe you want to rewrite it to kind of keep things working as you take these steps. Ultimately, you would like to, probably have that change something in a controller or send some kind of event up to the router that's going to then change the controller for that other part of the page, and your DOM would render appropriately. I had an interesting case in this particular app that I kind of compiled these lessons from, which was we had the kind of the main div that was the Ember app, and then there was one little thing up in the header that was kind of, it was an e-commerce product. There's kind of the current shopping cart total, how many items and what's the total. What I did for that is I basically just had an object that observed those values from the controller where they were maintained, and each time they changed, just did regular jQuery, find that div, update it. So it's not that jQuery is evil in small doses, it's just that in large doses it's unmaintainable, is the problem. Other questions?
Yeah, you mentioned, first of all, thanks for that. Great talk. You mentioned the closure part, build tool. And I didn't see in the slide, I didn't see the closure code that I would normally see. Is that sort of implied that Ember Rails can handle that?
So you can work in different ways. Some people like to have their closures and their kind of AMD defined blocks in their files. I prefer to kind of have as little boilerplate as I can, and so have my build tools add those closures around files.
If we decide to use something like Ember data, or obviously we're going to be using Ember models, is it easy to pull data out of them, from using jQuery?
So the question was, if we decided to use Ember data or Ember model, is it easy to pull data out of them using jQuery, like to display stuff, for example?
One piece of it, and that one piece still depends, like step 3 still depends on step 1, and the data from step 1 is in Ember, but we need that data in jQuery for step 3 to time to convert it.
Right.
Is it easy to interact in between?
Yeah, it's a good question. Let me think about it for a second. So there's a few different ways. There would be a few different ways to tackle it. One way would be basically to set some kind of global. So you could have a data structure that jQuery is aware of and that Ember is aware of, and have an observer when that thing changes. You're just going to set that global, and that's fine as a temporary thing. I'm trying to think. I think that's probably how I would approach it. You could also do your jQuery manipulation directly from inside of an Ember object. So you can move, kind of encapsulate it. It's still manipulating the DOM directly, but at least you've got kind of the Ember object model to help you keep it clean. Cool. All right, so I'm going to unhook, and Chris is going to hook up. While we're doing that, we're going to take just about 1 or 2 minutes and find somebody who's sitting near you and just who you don't know, introduce yourself, and then we'll come back together. Thank you. So Chris Selden, I mentioned, is a member of the Ember core team. He's based out in Seattle. What I didn't mention is that Chris and I worked together for about, I don't know, a long time, 8 years or so in total, maybe more. And the time where we really worked together the most was when almost everybody at the company we were working for, all the other engineers had been laid off. And it was Chris and I and a couple other people left. And we had to find a new development process. Our boss said, "Here, we have no project managers anymore, so you guys better figure out what you're going to do. Here's a couple of things to look at." One of the things on the list, thank you to our boss at the time, Ken, was extreme programming. So we looked at extremeprogramming.org. Chris and I printed out the homepage. I think there were 12 or 13 practices, and we circled a few of them. One of them was pair programming. And we gave it to our boss. We said, "This is what we're going to do." He said, "Sounds great." And so then Chris and I, not knowing any better, pair programmed with each other for about a year, every day. Nobody else. There was nobody else. And we almost killed each other probably 3 or 4 times. But that year, I probably learned more about software development than any other point in my career. And it's in large part because Chris is quite gifted in this area. And so I'm really happy to have him here in New York to share some of that with you guys.
Thank you. So Luke asked me to give a lightning talk, and I didn't know what to talk about, so I asked for a suggestion. He wanted me to present something we use in our code called a buffered proxy. And he thought it'll be simpler than the previous topics you've tried to talk about. And so, but I can't just jump into that without giving some people background on an Ember. We have an object controller. The idea of an object controller is it proxies to its model, and then you can add additional decorations to it. Now, a lot of people starting out Ember get confused about the MVC pattern, because there's a lot of them. There was one in the 80s that doesn't quite resemble that. Ember started in Sprout Core, which is based on Cocoa. And in Cocoa, the model and the view are separated by the controller. And the controller is what they call a mediating controller, in which it actually presents the properties to the view to bind to. Now, in a lot of frameworks that use data binding, this is actually a very common pattern, but it's named something different. Luke and I worked on a Windows Presentation Foundation app, and they called it the view model, and the pattern was model view, view model. But the basic idea is you want bindings work well on properties, and you want the views to just be very dumb, and you to extract. So when he was talking about all the stuff that doesn't directly touch the DOM you want to bring up to the controller, you're basically, the properties in your template are the interface of that template. And whatever can present those properties can reuse that template. And maybe because a lot of people ask for, like, why can't I write expressions in my views? Well, in these patterns, what is called a view is actually an Ember template, and what it's a view is more sort of the metal between the DOM. And anyway, they would like to do like if, and then some logic to display something. In data binding frameworks, you really want to just say if should show something, because that's all the template cares about, is whether or not it should render that portion. And it's tempting when that maps one-to-one. You could say, like, if in edit mode, but then there's invariably another condition that shows up, like if in edit mode and isn't dirty, or is dirty, and then you start wanting to write expressions. If the interface was just should show panel or whatever, there's never any need to rewrite the template, never any need to touch it. It just works, and you just change the computed property in the controller that knows how to present that data. So Cocoa has this. Knockout uses the same thing as the WPF. There's Martin Fowler talking about the presentation model, which is essentially describing the same kind of thing. He breaks it down into even more kind of subtle patterns that are all sort of overlapping. So when people talk about controllers in Ember, the main thing they're doing is presenting properties to the templates to bind to. So controllers extend an object proxy. And what an object proxy basically does, the two kind of important things are, In Ember, everything you go through a get and set. And the idea behind that is because JavaScript doesn't have any way to hook message sending. That's coming later. I have no idea how it will perform, but I mean, it's in Chrome right now, and we have spiked something that kind of hid this and worked, but it didn't perform very well. But so it's kind of a pain, but it's a nice abstraction to do the message sending because it allows you to do a hook for when your object doesn't have that property, how should that property be resolved? And so the idea behind the object proxy is that get to that key gets delegated to its content. So with that, we're going to kind of start on my little demo. So I have a basic app that has two bound text. Oh, I'm showing the final one. Let's see. Okay. So this one is bound directly to the model, and as I type, it's affecting it right away. Now, a lot of forms will have save and cancel, where you don't actually want to apply those changes to the model right away. If you're using Ember data, you can change the model right away and while it's in a transaction and roll it back. When it's in a transaction, you can't do anything with it from anything else. And so even though we use Ember data, we still use the technique I'm going to show you just because to avoid some headaches around save and cancel for a simple form. So just to give you an idea what's here, we have an application route that's returning a model. Our edit route uses that model. And in addition to our index route, we have an edit route. The templates, very simple. Our app template is just showing the data in the model. Index is just linking to the edit. And then the edit template has two inputs that are bound to the first and last name. So very simple app. Now we're going to just add in our, so the idea of the buffered proxy is it's a mix-in that's going to be able to be mixed in to the object controller. And on its unknown property hook, it's going to check if that property is in the buffer. Oops. And if it's not in the buffer, it's going to delegate up to the content. And then on set unknown property, instead of delegating to the content, it's just going to keep it in the buffer. And it has a method for applying those buffered changes to the content. So the reason I'm using to people who use Ember a lot, they're used to this dot get and set. The reason I use this standalone here is because the content is just a plain, it's not an Ember object. So, and then on discard it just replaces the buffer so that all the gets start to fall through again. So in our app, before our edit controller was just being generated for us. Now we're going to extend an object controller with our buffered proxy. And then in the edit route, when we leave that route, we're going to discard the changes. And on the save event, we're going to apply the buffered changes. Oops. So now we've added a button to save with an action save. And then if we just click index, because the deactivate, it's going to throw away what's in the buffer. So now when I type, the binding is not updating. When I save, it updates. Now, the only problem with this is that if anything else is bound to the controller that has the buffered changes, what we just did there is not actually the way that the way that Object Proxy supports observing is that whenever there's hooks in Ember, if you have a will watch property and a did watch property, a did unwatch, you can hook into when somebody tries to observe a property in an object. And when we do that, we add an observer to the content, the corresponding key in our content, and we fire our change events corresponding. So this relies on us actually setting the content to fire a change event. Since we're keeping stuff in the buffer, we need to notify will change, set, and did change in order to get that binding. So now I'm going to bind in our template first and last name outside of the input. But so this one's bound to my buffered controller, and this one is bound to the application controller. So when I refresh, one of them will update, and when I hit save, the other one will. So the next thing we're going to add is just tracking of that there are changes. So this is a little bit more complicated because we have to get the underlying content to know what the current value is so that we know when we've changed it back to the current value. And then when we that's the one thing I forgot to show. When we're discarding, we're also sending the change events to let things know that so this now is going to change. We've also added a bound attribute to has buffered changes and a style for that. So now when we type, it shows it is dirty, and when we turn it back, it's now. And when we save, so this is just giving you an idea of simple ways to solve problems when you understand how everything is working behind the scenes, and I will push that up to after during the meetup to yapplabs, so you guys can check it out. Anybody have questions?
Where are you using an internal buffer object instead of looking for attributes like on the actual buffer object itself? Sorry, what's your buffer objects there? I'm using like an internal buffer object separate from the actual buffer.
When you say actual buffer, Matthew,
The mixed in, yeah. Sorry, yeah. I guess the thing that you'd be mixed into, which is maybe way to treat it.
I'm still not.
I'm saying using this buffer instead of just like looking on the current object of this for these properties.
so there's only, I think,
No, what he's saying is, why didn't I create these properties?
Well, why use an internal property of buffer instead of just setting the attributes, the properties?
I'll just track them so I can clear them easier. The one thing is when doing the I could shadow them by defining them, you're right, on the object itself. So as soon as they're defined, they'll stop proxying. So I could have done that. It's just this gives me an easier way to, I could have tracked that differently. It's just tracking which one, the keys, so that I can do the dirty tracking. So I did this out to the end, and then I went back. So I didn't actually write it in these steps. I went to this, and I deleted it back into all of those steps, so you could kind of,
one thing I think that's worth mentioning is that we successfully used a version of this that looks pretty close to kind of version 2 or so for many, many, many months in our app very successfully. So like there's a lot of bells and whistles here in terms of like the observability and all this stuff. If you need less than that, you don't have to go, you don't have to go all the way necessarily.
if you just need a form that, but the main thing is when you discard the changes, it's easier to just drop the buffer. Because even if I set the keys on the proxy directly, that would shadow it from proxying to the content, but then I still need to track what I'm going to discard, so I would still create an object and say these are the keys that I've buffered, so I know which ones to go through and drop out.
Any other questions for Chris?
So the question, you don't have to show code for this, is that this seems like a pretty good solution to one of the problems we're facing, which is while people are editing and upload entry to the server, one of the things that Ember Data allows you to do, not everybody does it, is to have your changes from the server pushed into your Ember model. Ember Data model, which then you can bind it, and sometimes that will do things as you do things. So this, when you're in an edit state, especially if you're creating some work as part of a learning system, you don't want that to do. If you're not creating state, you want to see what other people are changing. So these are, what can this be a solution to that kind of problem?
Absolutely, that's exactly one of the first things that drove it actually, is we had a form with save and cancel, but that model you could change from a sidebar, and this allows you not to need to put that model in a transaction until somebody clicks save. Because what was being edited on the sidebar didn't actually conflict with the, it was a property you couldn't actually edit on the form.
What's cool about this solution also for that question is that any properties that are not in the buffer, so the user hasn't edited, stay live bound. right? It's just following through to the object, and so it'll actually get updated if we given an out-of-band change, which is kind of a nice feature.
As granular as possible of what are you trying to prevent problems. If you're not editing, then don't worry, just use the magic of Ember and do everything you need to do.
And this will work with, it gives you some sort of transaction support to an object that you're not using Ember data, or
And maybe you're
just getting
jQuery
something,
Ajax.
jQuery Ajax.
Cool. Any other questions?
Yeah, so let's say you're playing the game, and the game is add the next word to the sentence. You have somebody on the other side, they're playing the game. That server sent the updated message, right? And you've got your buffer message.
So, I mean, this one, it's whoever, it's going to apply the buffered change. If you wanted to, you could easily track, like, okay, version. I mean, you can expand this very easily from what I just showed you here, especially the dirty tracking. I mean, you could track it per property. You could version it. So if if you got a newer data, you could decide, because that model is going to be updated and it's still behind the proxy and you haven't applied it, you could have it notify. So when you get a set unknown property, you could still observe the model behind and know when it changes and tell the user this has new data. Since you have access to it, you could have a way even to expose like original value. I mean, if you tracked, and if you think of it like missing, method missing on Rails or something, you could even check the keys that are coming in for like, does it end in changed? And take changed off of it and just check it against the underlying content, compare that to the buffer, and say, yes, it's changed. Anyway, it's just this idea of having that buffer and the underlying thing and being able to observe both of them allows you to deal with all sorts of situations like that. Probably not in something I could do in a lightning talk, but anyway.
Cool. All right, thanks so much, Chris. Appreciate it. So, unfortunately, we're not going to have a game show segment tonight, but we promise next month, June 20th, we will have perhaps the most awesome game show segment that we've had yet. As those of you who have been here before know that we've done Jeopardy. We've done the Wheel of Fortune. What else have we done? I don't know. We've done others. Hangman. We did Pictionary last time. That was pretty crazy. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a short break. Ryan's going to get set up, and then we're going to get back together. So if you need another drink, I think the food's gone. But do that. And also, again, introduce yourself to somebody you don't know. I'm going to quiz somebody at random to see who they met. Learn one fact about them. All right. So we were just talking about the game show segments that we've been doing. Well, in the first couple of game show segments, there was a guy who was sitting at that back table right over there, where Pavan's sitting there. Wave, Pavan. Yep, right over there. Sitting right back there. He's very quiet. And when nobody else knew the answer to the question, guy would raise his hand and give the right answer every time. And so finally, I went up to the guy and I said, dude, like you really know your stuff. Introduced myself. I said, I'd like to get you to give a talk when you're ready. That was about 6 months ago. And finally, we have Ryan Toronto up to share some of the wisdom that he's learned working with Ember, both as a startup and now as an independent Ember consultant. So very happy to have Ryan with us tonight.
All right, thanks, Luke. All right, so my name's Ryan Toronto. I do Ember.js consulting. And today I'm here to talk to everyone about prototyping Ember applications. I think when a lot of people think of building Ember applications, they think, okay, this is going to be this big project that I have to build a backend service for, and they don't really think the word prototyping. And I want to show that you can prototype an Ember application in about an hour. So this talk's about 30 minutes, and we're going to kind of build out an application here. So the first thing I recommend you do is we start with URLs. Ember is really good about handling applications that are URL driven. So let's just come up with lists of URLs, and once we do that, our application sort of flows out. So let's say we're building project management software.
Sorry, we're just moving the mic down just so we can get the sound. For those at home.
Hello? It's better? Okay. All right, sorry about that. So we're going to build project management software, glorified to-dos. So let's start with URLs. And I think this is a good set of URLs. We're going to have projects new, projects one, and the tasks. It's very easy to look at these URLs and tell what the pages are going to do. Once we have this list of URLs, we're going to turn them into the Ember router. So let's start with the projects route. We're going to use a resource, and what the resource does is it lets us map our nouns to the router. So let me start that over. It's going to let us map our noun objects to the router. So these are things. These are going to be like projects, like tasks. We also want to have a project's new URL, and we're going to use a route for that. We're going to use routes to represent our adjectives, our verbs, so our actions. This is going to be a nested route, so it's going to exist under the projects. And if you look at the routes, when they nest, they form that kind of nested URL where they append their name onto the parent. We're also going to have a route with a dynamic segment. This allows us to load any project. So projects one, projects two, projects n. This is going to be, it's nested under projects. And finally, we're going to have a tasks route, and we're going to take all the things we just used to build projects, and we're going to build out tasks. So it's nested with a dynamic segment. So this is going to be the final version of the router. And once you have this final version, all of the objects, the files that you need to build your Ember application, like I said, will just flow out of this. And these are all the files we're going to use. And this is a lot of files, and that's 38 objects I just showed you. And that's really intimidating when you're getting started with Ember, that I have to know these 38 different things for those 4 URLs. And actually, you don't have to know those things. What Ember is going to do is it's going to look at your router, and it's going to try to figure out what you're doing. And it's going to create those objects at runtime if they don't exist. So you only need to worry about the objects. You only need to worry about these objects when you're building these sections of the application. So we're going to start, and we're going to build the projects page. So, oops. So we're going to build the projects page. This is the page that just lists all the projects in our app. So the first thing we need to do is build a projects model. And this is just going to be a Ember data model that has a name, and it has many tasks. Then we need to build a template, and this template is going to tell us how many projects we have, and it's going to list them, and it's going to link to them, and the links will allow us to drill down. And right now, this is all we need to get our projects page working. So there's a problem here. It works, but there's a problem, and that's we don't have any projects to show. And at this point, this is where I think there's a couple different directions we can go when building this app, is how do we get projects in here? And I'm going to talk about them and kind of the pros and cons. So the first is, well, we could just build a backend service. We could build some sort of RESTful API backend where we can send projects and it writes them to a database and we can query it to pull projects out. Problem with that is, I start off this talk saying, well, we can prototype an app in under an hour, and that takes a long time to build. So let's stay away from there. Also, too, if we go down that road, we're really kind of prototyping this full stack projects application. We're not prototyping an Ember app. So we could use the project's new route to just add in projects. We already said that's going to be there, that's going to exist. The problem with that is, and why we're not going to use it, is that when we refresh the page, those projects will be gone. They're only in like the current state of our application. So, if we're trying to show someone this prototype we're building, we'll have to add new projects every time, then show them. The other way we could just create dummy projects and stuff them into the controllers. We're not going to do this, though, because it mixes test data with application data. And imagine you're prototyping this app. You have, we have 4 URLs now. We create 8 URLs, and we're going to have tons and tons of test data intermixed with our real code. And then when we're ready to actually switch it over to maybe a production service, we have to go through our code and pull all this stuff out. And this is really hard to manage. So we could use Ember Data's fixture adapter, and that's what we're going to use. And the reason we're going to use this is because it handles all those cases, or it's specifically designed to handle all those cases really well. So it stores seed data. So when our application boots up, it can be booted up with projects. Keeps test data separate from code, and it acts just like your backend. We can query it, and we'll get into some examples there in a second. So how do we use a fixture adapter? It's actually really easy. It comes with Ember Data. When we're defining our store, we just specify that as the adapter. And we need to set up fixtures. So we have these objects that represent the classes of our models, so app.project. And we just put a key on there called fixtures, all capitals. And it's an array that holds JSON that will be loaded into the models. We do relationships. We can just specify an array of IDs, and those IDs will exist as other fixtures. So this is my projects fixture, and the first project has 2 tasks, and those tasks can be defined in the task fixture. So let's go back to our projects application. And now that we have this fixture adapter set up, we can specify on the project's index page the model that the controller should wrap. And we do that. We just use a snippet, and our projects will load. So now we have data we can interact with, and it's always going to be there every time we refresh our application. So we're going to look at how the fixture adapter works. And this part right here, this is more how Ember Data works. No matter what the adapter is, these are Ember Data conventions. So if we want to find a specific record, we just do app.project.find and pass in an ID, and that will return the specific record. If we want to find collections, we'll call find with no parameters. So this will return all of our project fixtures. So that's nice, but imagine that we know our API, our backend, is going to have a URL like this, where we hit the projects.js, or the projects endpoint, and we give it a query parameter called search, and we want this to return all the projects that have the name has test, or the name matches this query parameter. In Ember Data, how we call this is we just call this right here. The problem with this is our fixture adapter has no idea that when we call this, what it should return. So it gives us a function called query fixtures, where we can implement all this logic. So if we're going to do this app.project.find and search for test, this is a very simple query fixtures function that says, okay, if you're searching for, if you're querying app.project and you have a search, your query hash has a key called search, Then we're going to create a new regular expression, loop through all the fixtures, and only return those that match that regular expression. So I've kind of been lying when I've been showing you these fixture adapter examples. By default, they simulate latency, or they simulate asynchronously. And I think this is a really nice feature because when you are building a real application and you are talking to a backend service, those calls are going to be asynchronous, those HTTP calls. So if we were to do this, if we were to say app.project.find1, then get the name, we're going to get back undefined. But if we wait 50 milliseconds, the data will be in there. This can be disabled, or you can change the latency. That's milliseconds is a unit there. I like, for tests, really low number, because I want my tests to run quickly. But when I'm actually building the application, I put a pretty high number, or a number that is what I expect the backend service. I think this works out well because if you're working with a slow backend, you can kind of get a feel for it right away. Okay, so let's go back to our projects application, and let's build out this URL that does project.new, or project/new. We're going to add a new project. So the first thing we're going to start with is a template, basic template form, and when you submit it, it's going to send a save action. Then we're going to create a controller that has that save action. It's going to save the project and then transition to show that project. I put this on the controller. I think that it's a pretty quick refactor to pull this out and put it in the projects route so that any sort of nested leaf you're in under that can save a project. But for now, we're just going to stick this on the controller. And a project's new route, when I showed you the template, it has a binding to the project name. And so it expects you to have a template, or expects there to be a project model that it can edit. So we need to immediately stuff a new empty project into our controller. And once we have this, we're able to create new projects. So far where we are, we have a projects page that lists all projects. We have an easy way to query for projects that match name. And we have a way to create new projects. And if we follow this, we can very quickly build out our application. And we can show it to someone, and they'll love it. And but you can see, like, you can very, very quickly show it to them, and they say, okay, let's turn this into a real application. And now you think, oh, okay, wow. So now I have to go build this backend service, and I have to think about how the API is going to respond, and all these things. And you've actually really already done that, because your fixtures kind of represent how your JSON payload should look. And you can see here that there's some subtle differences, but those are mostly cosmetic. The overall structure is all going to be the same. I do not think that anyone should ever be worrying about how their JSON looks. The Active Model Serializers project, which is a Rails gem that will very easily serialize your Rails models into JSON, is great if you're using Rails. If you're not using Rails, check out jasonapi.org. There's some discussion there about how can we standardize JSON? What should a standard JSON response look like? And I believe there's a page where they list other languages and other frameworks that follow this convention. And the beauty about using this is when we're ready to go to production, we've been using our fixture adapter to prototype our application, and we can just change this to the REST adapter. And all of a sudden, our application works. We don't have to go change anything else. We don't have to clean up test data. Everything magically works. So before I wrap up, I just want to tell a story about using the fixture adapter. About 2 months ago, I was working with a startup building an Ember.js application. And they had this application. It's a pretty straightforward CRUD application, but there's a lot of back-end API work that had to be done. And when we started building the front end, there was no API. There was no back-end service that we could query. And we didn't want to wait until this backend service was done, we wanted to dive right in and start building the application. So we use a fixture adapter, and we use the fixtures, on the model fixtures. And one thing that was really cool is that the guys that were building the backend knew nothing about Ember. They didn't understand it. They didn't even know what it was. But they could read our fixtures. They could read those simple fixture files that are just JSON. So they knew what the front-end guys were expecting. They knew, oh, they're expecting these keys, these models. If they wanted to change something, like say there was an address and that was just represented as a string, and they wanted to normalize that as another object, what they could do is they could open a pull request on the fixtures and just change the fixtures. And the front-end guys could look at those pull requests, and they knew right away, okay, the back-end's going to change. We need to adapt the Ember app to handle these changes. We need to add this address relationship. And once the Ember app was set up to handle that, the pull request could be accepted and everything worked. And after about, I think it was about 6 weeks of doing this, we set up a staging site. And when we went from using the fixture adapter to this RESTful API staging site, all we did was we had an initializer that changes which adapter gets used. And the application just worked. And it was really cool to be, never develop against this backend API, but just be able to flip a switch and turn it on. So, thank you.
Any questions for Ryan?
Yeah, this is just a general router question. I began learning Django, and it's focused on new sites. So instead of using the ID for the resource you want to get, like your resource might be an article, so you use a slug. That might be the title of whatever the article is. I saw it mixed in for Ember. That allowed you to do the same thing with the router, but I was wondering if that was considered a good practice or why you might not want to do something like that.
So the question was, if in Ember you can use a slug instead of an ID for URL parameter. Does that about sum it up? The answer is yes, you can do that, and it's perfectly fine. Inside the model hook of the route is where you can define how the model hook will get run when the user enters the application with a dynamic route. And instead of looking up the model by the ID, you could say, okay, I need to look up the model by a slug. So if you look back where I did app.find search equals test or search test, I would do app.find app.project.find slug project name. And that way you would have to implement that logic in your backend or your fixture adapter and query fixtures. And what is the hook? There's a deserialize hook. Is that what it's called now? It's always been that. And that will allow you, when you're using the link to helper, you want to display that slug in the URL. So deserialize will say, okay, I have a model. How do I turn that into a URL? And there you would just return the slug name instead of the ID. Serialize, that's it, yes. Thank you.
Just one quick thing though, IDs are strings. They don't have to be numbers. And so as long as it doesn't have a slash in it, you don't need to do anything special. It's only when it has the slash, like if you're formatting a date or anyway.
So that was, as long as there's not a slash in it, you can use the slug itself as an ID if you want.
Like negative performance implications if you use a slug versus an ID?
Ember converts all IDs to strings, so it's nothing to do with the front end.
The question was, are there any negative performance implications to doing this? And Chris said that Ember converts the IDs to strings anyway, so same thing. Other questions for Ryan?
How likely is, I mean, in terms of how likely is it to change? I know that I'm aware that right now it's in the use candidates.
Three now, yeah. So the question was, in terms of Ember, how likely is it to change at this point in terms of APIs and stuff like that? Steph, do you want to answer that one?
How about you? You're the one that's proposing to break it.
Touche. So, Yeah, I mean, so basically we are moving towards 1.0 aggressively. Any change that comes up that is breaking right now is, there's a lot of hand-wringing about it. That wasn't the case 6 months ago. 6 months ago, like, hey, there's a better way to do it, boom, changed. But we're definitely more stable. I would say since about January, February of this year, things have stabilized a lot. And it's been amazing actually to watch how the community has grown since the API stabilized. And I'll just say, I usually mention this, but like Ember Data is not the case for that. Ember Data's API is still very much in flux, still considered kind of alpha. But Ember Core is, at this point, a pretty stable API. So we are...
Something very drastic that you probably want the change to happen for it to break, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So
or if you're relying on broken or undefined behavior. So sometimes you might experiment and find something that works, but it's not referenced in any guides or docs. We can't support crazy scenarios that you've thought up. So you do that at your own risk. If you're doing something that's like, oh, this seems weird, post an issue or open a Stack Overflow comment and see if anyone else is trying to solve it, and usually people are, so anyways.
Yeah, totally. But I would definitely, at this point, is those of you who asked me this question, 6 months to a year ago, basically my answer was, unless you're willing to follow commits every day, don't use Ember yet. Now I happen to be one of those who is willing and likes doing that, so we were using it early. But now my answer to that question is very different. Like now, Ember Core is a great time to build apps on.
The one thing is we got to get this guy to finish his fixes to the router.
Yes, so Alex up here.
Big pain point still is the new router when you're doing some more complex things.
Yep.
It's getting better, but Alex is doing an awesome job at getting it up to speed, basically.
Yeah, and we're working to make those as non-breaking as possible, those changes, but there are just some things that need to get fixed in order to have the router work the way that people expect it to, in all cases.
I really didn't have anything to say other than the main blocker was the game show. That's very much more important.
Right. Thank you for prioritizing the game show over Ember Router. Neither of them are done, just saying. I'm just kidding. Alex has been working really hard. And I just as a shout out to the whole core team, there has been an amazing amount of work going into this project, not just from the core team, but from the wider community. The amount of issues opened and closed every day on GitHub, the amount of questions asked and answered on Stack Overflow is amazing. The people who volunteer their time to be mentors at the hacker hours is awesome. And the number of meetups that are springing up around the world. New York City meetup is kind of number 2 in size behind San Francisco, but there's more, more and more meetups starting every day everywhere. So it's really a really exciting time to be involved with the project, and it's awesome to see some of the apps that are getting built on it. With that, actually, I guess any other questions for Ryan before we wrap things up?
So you mentioned that you use fixture data sometimes in development also.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have like a guideline or like a best practice for when you would switch over from fixtures to actually so once you have implemented the server backend, when you use that server with actual maybe a copy of data from your production database or something, or where do you draw the line and what are the benefits of using fixtures versus?
So I use the
question.
Oh, yes, the question is, when should we're using the fixture adapter, when should we switch over? When do we draw the line to start using production data or data from a backend service? I use the fixture adapter as much as I can. It's very easy. I can kind of change the API in just a JavaScript file and have it work, and I don't step on anyone else's toes. It's also, it's easy to check out a Rails app and run it, but it's a lot easier just to have a fixture file open and changing it there. I do most development against a fixture adapter, and some testing and demoing against the production server, but fixture adapter if I can.
Cool. I'll just give you just an alternate answer to that. I use the fixture adapter very rarely. I probably will after seeing this talk. I'll use it more often because it was some great stuff that I actually didn't even know existed in there. But I will say that I have a personal obsession with kind of vertical, complete end-to-end slices of app development. And so to me, going for a long time with just the fixture adapter would feel like I cannot ship anything, right? I can't actually ship something that people could use that works. And so I would probably tend to try to get that API in faster. But so just another perspective on the question. Go into detail. So Steph just said there's some differences between the REST adapter and the fixture adapter to be aware of. If you do observe, run into those differences, those are GitHub issue-worthy things. So, create a fiddle, reproduce it, and tell us about it. So we are going to go for drinks to 45 East 18th Street, the Old Town Bar. It's between Broadway and Park, so basically just the other side of Union Square, the north side. If you have never come out for drinks with us, you should come. It is very casual. There's no there's no requirements of any sorts to attend and to drink or have a glass of water or whatnot. So I want to really thank the speakers, Ryan Toronto, Chris Selden. Awesome stuff. Thank you all for coming out, and I hope to see you at the Hacker Hours on Tuesday or at June 20th for Steph and Dominic, and if we're lucky, the 26th with Tom Dell.